it is currently not legal for a Cuban to contract internet access at home, even if they have the money, right? While foreigners, foreign business people, tourists do have that option or a possibility. They consider someone having access to the intranet as equivalent to having access to the internet, what we would think of as the internet. And so that's is not equivalent, because what they're talking about is an internal national network that has a relatively limited or selected group of websites that are nationally based, that have the CU at the end, right? And so that's not the World Wide Web, that's not the world of options that would be accessible on the World Wide Web. I think the survey that they do to find out whether someone has internet access or not is they ask them, have you used this over the past year? So you could have used it, you could have sent an email one time and you are considered having had access to the internet, right? You know, so depending on how you ask the question, you can get a really high number or a really low number, and depending on what you mean by the internet. In a country where the mass media is controlled, monopolized by the government, there is no mainstream media in Cuba, as we talk about it here in the United States. There's no corporate media, there's just the official media. They talk in Cuba a lot, the government talks a lot about things being a social good, or they want to have their access to the media serve a social function. And the good spin on that is that, hey, we want everybody to have equal access, and we don't want it to be something where only the wealthy or only the connected or only the powerful have it. We don't want it. That's their argument against household connectivity, because that's only going to go to the people with money. But, of course, this is also a very convenient way for the government to censor and to deny people access to information. And this can be then given as a reward or refused as a punishment, depending on what you want to say, who you are, what your involvement is. There are now in Cuba 119 or 125 public access points, but they're not public like a public library. They're public to whoever can afford them, right? And they cost the equivalent of a week's average salary for 1 hour of the internet. And although there is a scale of pricing depending on what service you use in these telepuntos, you know, if you just use internet, if you just use email, it's like $1.50. If you use intranet, it's like, I don't know, $2.50 or $3. And then if you use the World Wide Web, the internet, then it's like $4.50 or $5, right? And so, but any of those prices for your average person is astronomical. Given the extremely low salaries, and given the fact that people really need to prioritize other things besides using the internet, they need to prioritize milk and meat and transportation and clothing, right? All of which is more expensive than the people have money for. So you're going to spend extra money that you don't have on the internet. The cable was laid like 3 years ago, but for like a year and a half, there was no sign that it was being used, because it didn't change the average person's access to the internet at all. And then about a year ago, there were reports that it was finally, there was data, there was an uptick in the data that they could track about this cable. And at first it seemed like it was only going in one direction, so maybe they were testing it or who knows what. And then finally it seemed to be working like in both directions. And then, like 2 months later or a month later, they opened up all of these public internet access sites. And so there was an assumption, and there is an assumption, I think, even now, that there is some connection between the connection of the laying of the cable, the activation of the cable, and the opening of these internet sites. But I don't think that that's actually true. I think that the connectivity that the cable provides is really only benefiting select government and maybe academic priorities, and not benefiting, not serving the general public. The real key, and this is where Cuba really has a big fight, long way to go, the real key isn't to get information from abroad or to send information abroad. The real key and the real turning point will be when the internet allows Cubans to communicate with one another. You know, and that's what happened in the Arab Spring, is that people, they didn't like download democracy from the United States. It's really about the networking that happens within a country or within a community in their own language, with their own values, with their own priorities, and not so much what they get from abroad. However, the abroad thing is especially important because the internet also acts like a boomerang. You know, Yoani Sanchez, or even some pro-government blogger, right? There's a lot of pro-government bloggers who are actually quite critical in certain areas. That person writes something on the internet, and almost no one in Cuba reads it, even if they're pro-government. But it goes out of Cuba into the internet, and then there's various ways that whatever they write on the internet comes back to Cuba, the boomerang effect. Because the server's abroad, the Cuban government doesn't have control over that server. Anything that appears on the blog is automatically emailed to anybody who signs up for it, right? Because a lot of blogs have this, you can be a follower or a subscriber to the blog. And that is especially useful in a place like Cuba, where people don't have access to the internet, but they might have access to internet once in a while, to email once in a while. And so that article that you and I might find on the internet by surfing the web, they can just get in their inbox. And then there's the flash drive. You know, people in Cuba who might have a computer in their home. It might not be a personal computer because it might be shared with a lot of people, but they have a computer. They may then have a friend who has some internet access, so at night they go and they download X, Y, or Z, or they share X, Y, or Z, or there's a movie. U.S. policy still plays a role in the access or the lack of access to the internet in Cuba. And it plays a role in a couple ways. One way is that U.S. policy, to the extent that it is based on overthrowing the Cuban government, undermining the Cuban government, or regime change, what we call it, that will A, make the Cuban government fearful, and also give the Cuban government an excuse. If the U.S. government looks like it's using the internet as a Trojan horse, people in Cuba who are hardliners are going to say, hey, we can't let people have this because the United States government is going to use it to hurt us. This whole thing with Zunzuneo and this whole Cuba Twitter kind of saga gives the government the pretext to say, hey, we have to monitor and control because, hey, the U.S. government is trying to overthrow us with Twitter, with tweets, right? It's like kind of ridiculous, but there was clearly an intent there to spread the virus of discontent through using these. Google has, Microsoft and other companies have periodically suspended services that you and I would get for free because there's an embargo against Cuba, and even though they're not earning any money in Cuba through giving those services, they have often just, for legal reasons, to protect themselves, they have suspended various kinds of services. And when you go to them, it says, you know, you are in a country where we cannot provide service due to the embargo, whatever, right? So that's another issue that prevents certain access.